to be their security. They have national interests, their strategic interests. They're not going to let a NATO member being placed right under their soft underbelly.
So it is worse because Kennedy did the right thing in the Cuban Missile Crisis and had détente. They got the missiles out. It turned out to be a victory for our security. This time, it's literally the EU, Wall Street, other interests want to gobble up Ukraine, and they're treating Russia like it's Iraq.
That's right, Alex. You know, it's really something to behold for somebody who spent his first 35 professional years focusing in on the evil empire, the Soviet Union. It was evil enough. And it's very, very difficult for this old fella to turn his mind around and stop just assuming that the U.S. and NATO are telling the truth and kind of having to assume, from what I know and what I am observing, that it's just the opposite, that in this case, for the most part, with some exaggerations, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Putin himself are mostly telling the truth. And the big truth they're telling is, look, we told you years ago, we told you in February 2008, niet means niet. If you have any designs to bring Ukraine into NATO, forget about it, as we would say in the Bronx. Forget about it. Now, what happened? That was on the 1st of February 2008. Sergei Lavrov, who was foreign minister then as well, called our ambassador in, Bill Burns. He's now Deputy Secretary of State. And he said, look, there are rumors going around that you all are going to try to incorporate Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. We just want to make sure you understand this would be a direct threat to our security. And we say niet, and niet means niet. Now, Bill Burns reported that back to Washington in the top secret cable. And how do we know about that? Well, give credit where it's due. WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning. It's in the cable. I have the cable. It reads, just as I said, Bill Burns saying, look, you ought to be aware that I was called on the carpet here. The Russians feel very strongly about this. They predict that the country will fall apart if hostilities start by virtue of trying to get them into NATO. And so I'm just reporting this to you so that you'll know. Now, that was the 1st of February, 6 years ago, 2008. So what happened? What happened was this. On the 3rd of April, a NATO summit of the kind that will just convene in Wales on the 4th and 5th of September next week, a NATO summit in Bucharest decided, and I quote from their declaration, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, period, end quote. Now, what happened after that was this crazy fellow in Georgia, Saakashvili, thought that, you know, what the neocons were telling him about having his back, right? That they'd have his back. And so he started to give the Russians a bloody nose just to the north of the Georgian border. And now the Russians came back and gave him a very, very bloody nose, and the whole thing collapsed because the U.S. would never intervene in so far away a place with no real relevance to the U.S.
And Ray, just to interject, again, former top CIA analyst Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush joins us, a 35, 40-year veteran at the highest levels of global intelligence. Watching it that day with CNN announcing that Russia had just attacked Georgia for no reason, and reading the fine print that they had attacked Russian military bases in South Ossetia and Abkhazia and murdered them en masse, it shows the sheer insanity that our media went with that and said, yeah, let's send in NATO till the Russians threatened nuclear attacks on NATO bases, and then Cheney backed off. As it turned out, from the intel I had, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Georgian president had been basically, like Saddam was encouraged to go into Kuwait, quietly told, yeah, go ahead and do this, we've got your back. What were they thinking there, out of the blue, to just attack Russian military bases? Thank God it didn't escalate more. And then when I said, I'm glad the Russians are showing restraint pulling out of Georgia, They had all the neocons come out and claim, I'm a Russian agent. when literally both sides of my family came over on the Mayflower. I mean, that is how sick this has gotten. I'm a traitor. You're a traitor. You know, they said that about you because we don't want nuclear war, Ray. What is wrong with the ruling elite? JFK was no angel, but he would never act like this. Reagan didn't do stuff like this. George Herbert Walker Bush didn't do stuff like this. What is wrong with them?
Well, President Obama doesn't have any real strategy here. He's kind of looking around and seeing which way the wind is blowing. I say that facetiously, but that's pretty much what he said yesterday when he was asked about policy towards Syria, Iraq, and that kind of thing. He's a very weak leader, let's face it. And what's happened here is that the Victoria Nulands, who worked for Dick Cheney for most of her career and now is Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, she and John Kerry are running the policy toward these areas. Now, they were the ones that encouraged the coup d'etat in Kiev on the 22nd of February. You don't have to believe me. None of your viewers have to believe me. Just listen to the intercepted conversation. Here's Victoria Nuland speaking en clair, right? Not even encrypted, to the U.S. ambassador there in Kiev. And she's saying, you know, Yats is our guy. The other fellows can stay in the wings here, but Yats is going to be the next prime minister. He knows. He's been head of the central bank. He knows what austerity measures are going to be needed by the IMF. So he's our guy. Now, that was at the end of January, Alex, the end of January of this year. On the 22nd of February, there's a coup. And guess who becomes the prime minister? Yats.
And then Obama calls him elected when he was not elected.
Yeah, it says, yikes, it's Yats. Now, just to borrow a phrase from the Declaration of Independence, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, having that intercepted conversation between Nuland and Payette on YouTube showing that Yats was our guy. I mean, you would think that that would maybe disqualify Yats from becoming the prime minister of Ukraine. No. The chutzpah is such that it was thought to be a.
Well, that's what scares me. They don't even use encrypted telephones. They act so arrogant. And I've studied history, as I know you have, sir. These are the times in histories where you get arrogant elites. This is how we ended the last interview, and I want to get into this with you now, where they just start making wrong moves. They think they're invincible. They've never been in combat. I mean, that's one big problem with having all these people in government that have never been in combat like you and others. They just think they're invincible. They think they're bulletproof like 14-year-old boys. And anybody who studied history can see the incredible danger, the stance the Russians are getting in. They look completely freaked out. But have a lot of resolve, and I'm not even lionizing them. It's just a fact they're under attack overall. You broke down what it means to have the anti-missile systems in the Black Sea, and obviously have been snuck into Ukraine and Poland on record. That's come out. What is going to happen when you talk about launch on warning? Explain to people how this works, and then spend some time getting into where you think this is going. Is there some form of sanity that can abound? What are other intelligence analysts saying, both former and current? I know I talked to some of them. They're completely freaked out. What are your colleagues that are still in government saying?
Well, the basic problem is we have a bunch of sophomores who, as you point out, don't know what war is like. And they've got Obama's ear. And of course, Obama doesn't know what war is like. What saved us from war against Syria and a widened war in the Middle East at precisely this time last year was General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who does know something about war, has his head screwed on right, and went to President Obama and said, look, Mr. President, we know that you really favor those young folks in the White House and in the UN, and especially those tough women who want to protect everybody else in the whole world. But frankly, Mr. President, they don't know anything about war. We in the Joint Chiefs do, for better or for worse. And my colleagues have persuaded me I need to see you and to tell you not only to beware of that kind of advice, but that John Kerry, with all due respect, at the State Department, he talks about starting a war with Syria that would be his words, unbelievably short, end quote, war. Now, Mr. President, I hope you know that there's no such animal in the Middle East. There's no such unbelievably short war. That, again, with all due respect to Kerry, he did drive those boats up the Mekong, but that does not make you a strategic thinker. Worst of all, Mr. President, he's not telling the truth when he said yesterday, on the 30th of August last year, when he said yesterday at the State Department, no fewer than 35 times, we know it was Bashar al-Assad's government that fired those chemical weapons on the 21st of August. He doesn't know. We don't know either, but we think, at least we know, that the sarin used was not the sarin from Syrian government stocks. Rather, it's a homemade sarin, and we have the British to prove that because they had a sample, they've analyzed it, they've told me. And so, Mr. President, it's equally likely, we think even more likely, and so do the CIA analysts think, that it was the rebels, it was the people that you are supporting, it was the people that the Turks are supporting that staged this chemical attack outside Damascus on August the 21st for the express purpose of tripping your little red line that someone persuaded you to draw and to get the U.S. involved militarily in Syria. So, Mr. President, look, here's a deal, Mr. President. When you go into the Rose Garden tomorrow, why don't you blame it on me, says Dempsey. Why don't you say, we're ready to go. We have our ships in the Eastern Mediterranean, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff advises me that there's no time sensitivity to this. We could do it today or tomorrow or next week. We could do it next month. But I'm going to go to Congress now and ask for authorization. That's precisely what Barack Obama did on the 31st of August, less than 20 hours after John Kerry all but declared war in Syria. Now, why do I mention all that? Well, because it's exactly a year ago, but also because that's what has to happen now. General Dempsey will be going to the summit in Wales. I find it ironic because the real message for that summit is for the Welsh, because the basic problem here is that the U.S. welched on its promise to the Russian leaders that it would not move NATO 1 inch, was the word James Baker used, 1 inch farther eastward than Germany if the Russians acquiesced in the reunification of Germany. That was the deal, okay? That was the deal 25 years ago. We welched on it. It seems to be the height of irony that we're meeting in the next NATO summit in where the Welsh live, in Wales. Anyhow, Dempsey's going to be going there. There are other level-headed military people in NATO. I'm just hoping that they can inject a modicum of reason into their calculations and realize that the Russians, understandably, are not going to tolerate drawing Ukraine into NATO, period.
I know that you worked in and around Henry Kissinger, and here's the headline. The Assembly of a New World Order, Wall Street Journal, just came out minutes ago. The concept that has underpinned the modern geopolitical era is in crisis. He goes on to praise Libya and Syria wars, civil wars that were staged, and what's happening with Russia. It just sounds like the Prince of Darkness, Richard Pearl, bragging to women that he's a good killer, or Obama saying he's good at killing people. Last time I checked, he's never killed anybody with his own hands or pulled the trigger. It just smells of the Titanic running into an iceberg. It just smells of disaster to like see these crazy-eyed women. And I'm not saying that because they're women, but they look like crazy witches up there at the UN and at the State Department trying to start wars and looking crazed. Do a few more minutes with us, sir, because I want to get your take on how we can de-escalate this, where you think it's going. I want to play that clip of Putin, but to see Henry Kissinger now running around licking his lips, how this is going to bring in the New World Order, I mean, this is a key time, folks. Henry Kissinger has raised his head. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
We're on the march.